It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Chris Dickman from the University of Sydney. And it gives me great pleasure because not only have I known Chris for a long time, but he's an outstanding scientist and field ecologist. It's also an appropriate plenary, we thought, for Alice Springs here in the heart of Australia, because Chris has led an exceptional long-term study in the Simpson Desert, which gives, I think, a unique perspective on arid ecology in Australia. Chris has been recognised for his outstanding science. He's recipient of an ARC Discovery Award. He's been the New South Wales Scientist of the Year, and Whitley Awards. There's awards everywhere, and it all goes to show the fantastic things that come out of not only being a great scientist, but studying boom-bust cycles in arid Australia. Thanks, Chris.
Many thanks, Robin, and thanks also to the Ecological Society of Australia and to the organising committee for this opportunity. It's just great to be here. Well, for those of you who live here, for those of you who came in by car or by plane over the last few days, you might have noticed that the country around here is looking a little bit brown. There's not a lot of greenness to be seen. If you had come in around 4 years ago perhaps, you would have seen a completely different situation. You would have seen a country that was bursting with greenness, water lying on the surface, and this would have been representative of one of the boom periods that characterise the arid regions of Australia. You would have seen gushing water, you would have seen clay pans that were full, waterholes that had filled up. You would have seen a plethora of different species that emerge at these times. Things like frogs that emerge from their underground burrows, birds that fly in, and a great range of wildflowers and other life bursting forth. So these are the boom periods. The busts, on the other hand, are the longer periods that punctuate the booms. They tend to be periods of often several years when surface vegetation cover becomes a lot more scarce. The images here on the left indicate an area in Western Queensland in drought in 1990, and then just a couple of years ago in 2012 after really heavy rains. And you might notice that there's a little bit of a difference in vegetative cover. The boom-bust cycle, I guess we can't really call them cycles. They're not regular in the sense of some of the northern hemisphere cycles, but boom and bust phases perhaps are characterised and driven by heavy rainfall events, sometimes by on-site flooding from distant rainfall, and they're characterised by large and usually ephemeral bursts in productivity. They may last for a year, a couple of years, but usually not much longer than that. The environments in which these sorts of resource pulses actually do occur quite widely. They're not restricted to arid regions. They do occur in parts of Southeast Asia, China, for example, with the bamboo flowering events, New Zealand with the beach masting events. But they are nonetheless prevalent in arid regions, and it's probably fair to say that they're particularly characteristic of arid regions of Australia, most particularly the central and northwestern regions. They are highly variable in time and space, and they do bring great opportunities, ecological opportunities, not just for the calling forth of the myriads of species and ecological interactions that occur after the rains, but they also bring some hazards as well. A couple of obvious hazards are depicted in the bottom right panels of the figure. The bottom one is a new university vehicle that we carelessly placed in a dry swamp bed, and the other one is Bruce Campbell, a mayor in Western Queensland, sitting with a neighbour in his backyard with his feet in the overflowing waters of the Cooper. What I'd like to do in the presentation this morning is to use the long-term data that Robin mentioned to talk a little bit about the effects of rainfall as a key driver and some of the other processes that occur in the boom-bust environments that we've been studying. I'll look particularly at the effects of fire and introduce predators, and I'll be looking primarily at these effects on small vertebrates as the case study group. I'll be casting the information in terms of the opportunities that they provide both for the biota and for us as ecologists to study them, and also then look at the hazards that can be attendant, particularly with the boom periods. I'll comment very briefly on the effects of climate change and the implications for management of these boom-bust cycles as well. Well, first of all, the location. I guess this is probably familiar to many people. Much of Australia is arid, depending on the definitions you take. Up to around 2/3 or 70% is arid and semi-arid. I'll be talking about a biome primarily that's characterised by hummock grasses, by Triodia. The area depicted here in green covers around a quarter or so of the continental land area. So it's an immense, very important part of the Australian landscape. I'll be focusing in particular on one area where the long-term studies are being carried out, shown by the red star in the just over here, far western Queensland, on the edge of the border with the Northern Territory, and this is where most of our work has been carried out. The study region is in the northeastern part of the Simpson Desert. It's a region characterised by long red sand dunes. Spinifex dominates the dune fields. It provides a cover of 30 or 40%, sometimes more in the dune valleys and the sides of the dunes, but becomes a little more sparse on the crests. It's a fairly harsh environment in the sense that the temperature variation is quite great. We've experienced temperatures well below freezing to over 50 degrees. It's prone to fires, particularly after big rainfall events that historically have come at a frequency of around 25 or 26 years. And I'll be talking about a data set that's been collected for nearly 25 years from this region. The actual area is shown here. It's on 3 properties primarily in Western Queensland: Cravens Peak, Carlo and Ethabooka. We have 12 main sites on these properties, and each of the sites is, we have between 2 and 5 1-hectare sampling grids for small vertebrates, but we also carry out sampling of vegetation, structure and floristics, invertebrates, and collect weather data at each of these sites too. We try to get there as often as we can. It usually ends up being between 3 and 6 times a year for the long-term sampling. When we're there, we open the pitfall traps, which are the primary means of censusing the small vertebrates. These are just simply pipes in the ground with a bit of aluminium fly wire drawn across the top to intercept the animals moving on the surface and guide them into the pits. So the bottom left panel shows a set pit with the fence running either side. And the bottom right shows a close-up of the pit itself. So these are our, I guess, units of the base units of sampling. Some of the study species, there's a number of rodents. These are among the more common ones. The desert mouse in the top right, the sandy inland mouse, and the Spinifex hopping mouse at the bottom. They're all reasonably small. They get up to around 30 grams in the case of the hopping mouse. They're primarily omnivorous, including seeds, green plant material, and insects in the diet. The desert mouse perhaps a little more herbivorous than the other two. Other species do come in from time to time, such as house mice and native long-haired rats. There's also a diverse assemblage of small dasyurid marsupials. The largest of these, the Mulgara, gets up to around 100 grams, the size of a small rat, I guess. It's the more carnivorous of the dasyurid marsupials. And the rest of the assemblage of dasyurids is made up by variously sized but always smaller species such as the ningauis, dunarts, planigales and so on, usually no more than 20-25 grams. and these smaller species are all insectivorous. So what I'd like to do is begin by looking at the first opportunity that these sort of environments present, and this is the opportunity that comes when it rains. The top panel here represents a simple trace, monthly rainfall over the time course of the study from 1990 to close to the present. The bottom trace represents the capture rate of one of the mammal species, the sandy inland mouse. And probably all you need to do is to cast your eyes down from the top panel. The line here represents, I guess, what we can call the average annual rainfall, if averages really aren't a good word to use in this context, but this is the rainfall that we might expect over the long-term record. There were several events that in 1 month achieved greater than the annual average, and after each of these events, if you run your eye down to the lower panel for the sandy inland mouse, these were followed by an increase in the numbers, increase in the capture rates of the species. If you take a simple correlation approach and lag the capture rate of the sandy inland mouse by 6 months, you get a strong correlation. That is, if you get a big dump of rain within 6 months, you get a really quite dramatic increase in the numbers of this rodent species. This sort of pattern is seen in some of the other rodents as well. This is a similar trace for the Spinifex hopping mouse. The big rainfall events tend to drive eruptions in the numbers of this species. The other thing to point out that's of some interest, I might try to come back to it later, is that there are long periods when these animals just disappear completely from the trapping record. Yet when it rains, they appear at each of the 12 sites pretty much simultaneously. They've clearly been there all along, and we just haven't been catching them despite the intensity of the trap effort that we invest. But usually 6 months after rain, these guys are bursting forth as well. Similar pattern for the largest of the dasyurids, for the Mulgara. Here the lag is 10 months. It's a slightly messier pattern than that for the rodents. And this seems to be due to the rather constrained life history of the Mulgara. Mulgaras breed once a year in late winter, and if rodents have erupted over the winter from the previous summer rain, then there's a large amount of food for the Mulgaras to eat, and they do well. Their numbers increase through increased survival. And the 10-month lag here reflects that constraint on the life history and the availability of food in the form of rodents. So this is a pattern that is not unexpected, and all these species are taking advantage clearly of the rain. It's not something that's universal though, and if we look at the pattern for some of the smaller dasyurids, here this is the trace for the lesser hairy-footed dunart. This species, in contrast to both the Mulgara and the rodents, does rather poorly after heavy rain. This is a pattern from one site, as were the patterns I've just shown for the Mulgara and the two rodents. For those 3 species, if you look at the patterns across all of the sites, the patterns are pretty much the same. And Aaron Greenville, in his talk on Monday, would have shown you the synchrony in the populations of those species. For the small dasyurids, there is no synchrony. They appear to respond negatively to rainfall in this area, but there appear to be other covariates that are important as drivers of their populations in other sites. So they seem to do their own thing. They're quite idiosyncratic in terms of their response to rainfall and a range of other factors. So these again provide great opportunities for recasting your thinking about how these arid environments work and the true nature of the boom and bust cycles. They're clearly not. It's not a one size for all sort of arrangement. The ways that the populations change in these situations are, and I haven't shown the data here, but from bodies of other work, we know that the rodents increase in numbers through reproduction and survival. In the aftermath of the big rainfall events, usually over summer, there's a large amount of food and the animals slow down. They become much more sedentary, burrow sharing increases. As they get cosier together in their burrows, reproduction increases, survival of the young increases, our recapture rates go up. And it's as if the whole system is slowing down, and becoming a little more sedentary. For the dasyurids, for the mulgara, is a very similar pattern, but for the smaller dasyurids, something else is going on. Many of these shifts are also driven by long-distance dispersal. Again, I won't show you the information, but we've got good evidence to indicate that many of the small species, including the tinier species, the 8 or 9 gram dunnuts, are moving over 10 kilometres to get to areas where presumably resources are becoming more rich for them to access. One of the more surprising results from the longer-term work has been that after these events, when the rodents in particular are increasing, and many of the small dasyurids are decreasing or doing their own thing, there's an increase in their richness. That is, the number of species increases. And that provided the impetus for a look at another opportunity, another factor that might be operating. And this was the primacy during the boom periods of biotic interactions and interaction webs. So the results from the previous long-term work indicating that small dasyurid species richness increases at these times led to the question of why. If you look broadly across Australia, throughout the range of the mulgara, you tend to find more species of other small dasyurids co-occurring with mulgaras than you do in areas where mulgaras don't occur. The difference is around 5.5 species of small dasyurids that co-occur with the mulgara,